Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the very first season of Channel Zero, Cove. Ultimately, this is a show that was kind of commingled with the people that had did a video game called, or a video game of sorts called Creepy Pasta. Ultimately, if you guys do not know, you can go and watch this show. I would assume either one of a couple different ways. Here's my thing. I'm assuming you could probably maybe see this on Sci-Fi, the app service Sci-Fi. Ultimately, I've seen a couple things on the Sci-Fi app. I don't know if Channel Zero is on there, but ultimately you can check out the Sci-Fi app and find some other things as well if you don't find Channel Zero. I do know that this show is ultimately on Shudder, Shudder. If by and large you've never been into Shudder before, but you want to check this out because creepy pasta interests you, and now this show interests you, and this and that, dare in fact go into Shudder and check that out. You can get a free trial and watch this and a couple other seasons if you'd like to, or maybe renew a subscription for Shudder, or ultimately you can just go on any kind of movie or TV show app that you can dare in fact watch this show on for absolutely free, and then ultimately you can watch several other things on top of this show that who knows exactly if people might 100% be interested in it after I mention all the stuff about this show. So, Channel Zero, Cove. Ultimately, you can just call this Channel Zero Season 1. Reasonably, because ultimately I keep calling it Candle Cove because I think every single season has its own theme. It probably is gonna be like a very much like American Horror Story maybe, to where everything has its own like thing. I'm assuming. This for a lot of people, this is only like 6 episodes. So if a lot of people are just like, "Oh God, I don't want to get into like a 12 episode series, or I don't want to get into a 24 episode series and like invest that kind of time," this is only 6 episodes, and then plus there's multiple seasons. If you find this first season intriguing enough, step into your way into and opening into different other seasons to see if there's different kinds of stories you enjoy and this and that. So, how did I feel about this show? What is it about? Without a doubt, I think for some people that might have never seen this show, I think I might kind of give people like an incline or a lead up to ultimately let them know what is going on in this show. What is it worthwhile and watching about? If without a doubt, I really truly enjoyed it. At the end of the day, I would just kind of say that this is like I would call this a much more unsettling show, much rather than actually calling it scary. Reasonably, there are some very dark portions of this show going on, but then I can't also help to say that there's a lot of stuff that is done off camera that you just hear sounds of things, because it's TV 14. So I was just kind of like, like, okay, that kind of is just like, wow, like this show could have been way much more grittier and dark and whatever, but of course, with this show, they have to do things off camera and you have to hear sounds of things. Um, Reasonably within those kinds of shots, the camera angles really aren't honestly and truly all that great, because it just kind of like the way they kind of pan away to ultimately have you hear these things, like it's not the best job at trying to just like, it seems like the camera just stops and then there's like a thing going on there, and then like they shoot up close of what was the aftermath of something, and it's like, wow, that is just a really like awful attempt at like, man, the director couldn't have figured out a better way to like transition this stuff. or try to like do some other kind of interesting things to work with this TV-14 thing, or just kind of just um, like you would have thought they would try to work around the whole fact that they couldn't show anything or show much things on this show. Um, but I guess it is just what it is. Ultimately, I guess it really doesn't matter. But to me, it was just kind of like it looked so weird when you're just kind of like going into like they could have showed the aftermath of things, and I wouldn't have had to hear sounds and yeah. A lot of the times, this show is pretty slow. I guess that's one kind of marker that I could make. Sometimes the show is kind of murky to the point where I'm just kind of like, okay, like this movie kind of at some points kind of feels like Stand By Me, or kind of feels like It, or kind of feels like a lot of like a mixture of a lot of things. It gets to the point where there's a lot of dream sequences going on in this show, or things that you don't quite know is a dream sequence or not, or there's just times where things seemingly appear, and then you just have to kind of make some rational sense about it. So, what is the kind of lead up to this show? So, I thought that this show was kind of like it was an intriguing show, but probably not something I would normally go into. And then plus on top of that, it was just kind of like I found it kind of intriguing, but I thought that it was really, really slow. I thought it was like I was like, man, I was like, whew, I'm like, man, just only for 6 episodes, this still feels like you're really having to really and truly invest in the show for how like slow to the crawl it gets. So let's talk about this show. So I'm gonna give you a very cryptic lead up kind of going on to the point where I can kind of just be like cliffhanger, and then go into spoilers right after that, because people have maybe never heard this show. So Channel Zero is about a guy who otherwise comes back into town and kind of re-meets up with a bunch of people. Ultimately, he goes and like gets together with some old friends. They go and they have like a meal together and this and that. The guy ends up otherwise going into a separate room and ends up noticing that this girl is watching some old program that he used to watch when he was a kid. But he thinks nothing of it, and he just kind of comes right back into the the table with all the other people. Like I say, he thinks nothing of it just because like he doesn't go. It's like, well, hey, maybe she shouldn't be watching this, or like, because ultimately, like I didn't like it as a kid or whatever. Like he kind of just goes, oh, she's watching some show that I used to watch as a kid. What a coincidence. So the whole entire group starts like the guy pitches in and is like, hey, do you guys remember that show called Candle Cove? That's where this entire show rests its name on, is some cart or some supposed kid show, that ultimately, when looking back on it now, they're like, yeah, that show was pretty creepy, or yeah, that gave me the heebie jeebies, but I just couldn't stop watching it. um, yeah, they kept talking about Candle Cove and how it kept like really like traumatizing them or whatever. It's like, well, hey, it's kind of funny that your daughter was watching the same programming um that like we used to watch as a kid. Isn't that kind of funny? What is kind of interesting is that all of a sudden, like people start to seemingly vanish again. People start to die again. People start to go missing. And basically, they are coinciding all of this with all of a sudden this person coming back into town. Or reasonably, they're starting to coincide this with being that this Candle Cove show is coming back onto their TVs, and is like, which one is it? Is it because of this new guy? Is it because of this TV show? Could it be both? And this and that. We end up finding out that this main character, there's a reason why he is back in town. Like, there's a reason why he left. Um, and there's a reason why ultimately he seems to more and more the longer we go into this thing, like he seems to be the only one that could really be the solving of whatever's going on. It seems like he is the pinpoint focal point of this whole thing, and everything is relying on this character, and ultimately everybody else is just kind of like rationalizing other things in their head, or rationalizing that like that it's not this show, it's got to be something else. It's got to be just like, hey, kids being kids. So yeah, it it kind of comes into very much like at some point some weird rules, some very much super like things at some point, and it kind of does at some point kind of like in a quasi like sense. Yeah, it kind of is kind of like it chapter 2 or something along those lines, because ultimately like there's some people that got unscathed, so ultimately now, hey, there's a new generation of kids that can ultimately be um, ripe for the taking, and this and that. So yeah, so that's kind of my lead off to try to like kind of tell people what's going on, but then also kind of give them like a very much cliffhanger like thing, like basically almost like a summary of what this show is, to kind of keep people interested or whatever. Again, this show for 6 episodes was fairly slow. Um, Reasonably, I would say. I don't know if I could give this like a good and or bad grade. Because ultimately, like some of this, like there was a lot of slow stuff. There was a lot of stuff that I didn't quite grasp and or understand or be able to process at some points in this show. Um, there was a lot of weird and or bizarre visuals, and then just for somebody to ultimately wake up with a dream sequence or something like that, and that happens a lot in the show. It's just like, well, was this show just very desperate to just want to do weird and bizarre visuals, or have a weird and or bizarre show? Because I think that's what it was trying to approach, was just like, we're not going to really clear cut like help you understand this show. It was just like, no, we just want to do something freaking weird. And like, I know that might be just what creepy pasta really is just like a weird and or odd show. But like, then I don't think like 6 episodes is really enough to be able to like give me a full-fledged story and understanding of everything, because it seems like, okay, well, like this person is now a main focal point of this show, and like, okay, he's doing something weird, why? And then that like never really goes way too into the show, and then it just kind of just becomes like, okay, well, just whatever. Then this kid is just a small portion of the show, uh, and there's stuff that kind of gets like tossed in here and then is quickly forgotten about. And like, yeah, that's the main crux of the show, is just kind of like there's a lot of chucking and throwing and whatever in here because it's only six episodes, and it doesn't really feel quite enough time to invest in everything. And I think this should have been a much slower burn show, but it is what it is. And I think they kind of just recycled a lot of things over and over and over again. But anyways, so that's how I kind of felt about the show. I kind of feel like very 50-50 torn about it, about whether I should ultimately recommend people watching this or just kind of go, hey, like, if you already love all the creepy pasta stuff, then maybe you'll enjoy having this be something you can check out or go into or find some way of seeing it through whatever means that you want to. So, I think it's about time to go into spoilers about the show. I think I'm just gonna kind of overall just kind of bring up just kind of a bunch of just kind of like greatest hits of this show, not go through the entire story and just kind of like break it down, like kind of piece by piece, my feelings about things. But I'll just kind of bring some random things up and this and that. So, spoiler time. It's about the time again to spoil the show. Ultimately, I wouldn't say people need to desperately watch this show. I think that there like is something that uh, once you kind of get like where the show is going, you're just kind of like, okay, well, I guess I've been here for this long. I guess I need to see what's the hook of all this. What is the eventual like drawing factor of all this. So we go into this show, and plus it's been on for multiple seasons, so it's just like, okay, this show must have really been doing like some really blowing your mind stories. So there's got to be something about this show to where it's been on for multiple seasons at this point in time. And when I went into it and I was looking into it, it was in like the third or fourth season. So more than likely, if it does more than that, then I guess I'm really timelining exactly when this is coming out. But anyways, so we ultimately find out that this main character had been gone away, uh, and he had been uh, emotionally traumatized by his past. So he had went away to some asylum or some, I guess you could call it mental hospital, to get his brain right. All the while, we eventually realize that this character has a twin brother. That ultimately he would mention that his brother wanted to be a mayor and that they would share this mayor job. So we, excuse me, we go into the show, and as I said before, they talked about Candle Cove. Man, do they just consistently, repetitiously use the exact same footage, just like, man, they really get their money's worth out of this one like scene that they repetitiously put out there just over and over and over and over again in this one show. Every single time they show a clip of this Candle Cove show, it's the exact same clip every single time. Um, and I'm just like, man, like, and then like you get little slivers of like an extra scene out of this show to make it seem different every time, but it's just little tiny slivers of the show. It's like, man, did they only have one show of this Candle Cove thing? Like, come on. There, in fact, you find out that the reason why that this guy was so traumatized was we find out that this guy's twin brother ultimately had this special ability, some kind of like brainwashing or mind changing ability to tweak people's brains to ultimately kind of do what he wanted them to do, and this and that. We come to find out that this kid had been the person to, in all actuality, come up with Candle Cove. But it's much more than that. It's much more. So this kid, he ends up kind of putting people seemingly down this down this cave or down this like well cave-ish like thing, and like sending them down this hole, and so that way they could be, I would assume, like either sacrificed or ultimately turned into people to work for him at some point, and this and that. We have bizarrely this monster that comes and appears into this show and eats teeth, but bizarrely the entire creature is made out of a mixture of teeth. I'm looking at this character, I'm like, this is the weirdest thing. Like the creature thing has no eyes, it just has like teeth everywhere, to the point where you can't even tell where its nose is. You can only see its mouth, and that's it. Everything else is just teeth from toe to face. So, anyways, we get to the aspect to where immediately the guy comes back into town, and he already is re-meeting up with his old friends. And so the very first thing that he wants to do is ultimately kind of get some like records from that massive like murder that he kind of was like quasi involved with, or quasi could have been almost tied to at some point, and this and that. So we, excuse me, we go into this, and ultimately we have this guy go to the sheriff at that time and also mention like, hey, I want the records of all like the kids and everything like that. And the sheriff goes like, well, why? And he's like, well, I want to make a book out of this, but really I think what he wants to do is actually investigate this whole thing without having like a police officer hold his hand the entire way, because realistically, he like supposedly his mother told him that it's like, well, if anybody could figure out your brother's like death or whatever, like it's you, because ultimately his brother had ended up dying, and they have a whole thing where they kind of like they buried him and this and that, and like of course the mother was like saddened that her son died and blah blah blah. But anyways, so we go into this more, and we find out that seemingly the next generation of kids are all going either missing or are starting to all talk about Candle Cove. And so we end up having this guy like starting to see Candle Cove and start to dream about it himself. and eventually starts seeing things, and we don't know if it's real or not. We don't know if everybody else can see the exact same thing that he's seeing. Dot to dot dot dot. But because ultimately, what we end up finding out is that this Candle Cove thing was not actually being able to be seen by everyone. Because ultimately, supposedly the parents had mentioned that's like, yeah, I didn't quite understand why you kids would be both watching at a TV screen that had just static on it. It never made sense to me. And it's like, no, like that was the time that Candle Cove was on, and they're like, it was just static to me. So we ultimately end up having this desperation of trying to figure out who this Candle Cove show was. Nobody ever had a real legitimate copy of this Candle Cove show. Ultimately, people had seen it and tried to like replicate said footage, or tried to like do this and this and that to try to um, justify this footage that they had seen. But ultimately, like the people who had finally been able to like see this again and kind of like try to understand it, like there was no way for anybody to really and try to otherwise understand this thing. Um, but anyways, it ends up being that the main character guy ends up otherwise telling his mother that he had killed his twin brother. Like, but it gets down to the point where we realize that this brother needed to eventually just be killed because he was ultimately killing other people. And it feels like he was like losing grip or losing control, and ultimately it seems like he was going to like take no prisoners and this and that. All the while, we eventually notice that this guy is starting to bizarrely have these toothache problems, and we're just kind of like, okay, why? But in a flashback, we realize why. So going into this show, we eventually have it to where the sheriff eventually goes to this guy's home and mentions like, "Hey, I'm gonna bring you in, because you confessed to your brother's murder." They end up keep going and going and going until it's like, okay, well, hey, like you didn't do the right to the sheriff's place. Like, where are you taking me? The sheriff ends up taking them to some abandoned place, and ultimately, you have all the people that used to watch this Candle Cove show. They're all in this room with this guy, and they are trying to have him confess for all these missing people, or these people that end up getting killed when they were children. It ends up to where we have one woman that consistently mentions that she had like some kind of seemingly through emails, seemingly like message back and forth with this guy consistently, towards like it was like every day. um Seemingly this girl had some kind of quasi infatuation with this guy, and this and that. So she goes and she tries to save him because she thinks it's like, oh, like what are they gonna do? Like he had ultimately confessed to quite possibly hurting his brother and this and that. So, like, what are they gonna do to him? Why not bring him in to be arrested or whatever? Seems a little weird. So she follows up to find this guy, and ultimately they hash it out. It ends up that seemingly like guns are like in the air and people are just kind of like, okay, what the heck is going on? People are getting pushed to ultimately just go, no, I want this guy to seek justice because I believe that he was the person that killed all those people before, and it isn't really true. Leading to where eventually, like, these, like, the sheriff ends up getting kind of, like, a kidnapping kind of charge put on him, as well as just kind of like, okay, well, now, like, we have the deputy that is now sheriff, and ultimately she is, like, all heck is going loose, and she's, like, crazily, like, everybody's, like, crazily going everywhere. All the while, eventually, we get to the point where all these kids are consistently seeing the show Candle Cove, and eventually they all start to. Not only it seems like there's random people running around with these outfits, and then eventually the guy is grabbing onto them, not knowing if it's a real thing or not, chasing after them in the woods. They eventually just kind of get away at some point. But I think in their mind, in this and that, or in dream sequences, these things keep appearing and kind of like throwing a wrench in their sleeping habits or their whatever habits, just because it's just like the visuals are so disturbing to them, which I never really saw that at all. So we eventually have it to where seemingly this main character guy is otherwise just, again, he's starting to get this like tooth like coming in, and you couldn't quite understand why at that moment, but we end up having a flashback where the brother is mentioning that, hey, know how you can tell the difference between me and my twin? I have an extra tooth that he doesn't have. So you find out that like this guy is getting an extra tooth. So slowly but surely he's becoming more and more looking like his other brother. And then eventually, supposedly, like his brother is coming in to his mind. He's kind of like warping him or manipulating him, and eventually, at some point, he is going to take over. Is what we find out. Eventually, it gets to the point to where the mother is believing the son, and ultimately, she is helping him at some points, finding some kind of like things about this whole canonical thing and how like there's not a real actual copy of the show anywhere. So we end up eventually having it to where, okay, seems like there's a group of kids that are starting to cause a ruckus. Eventually, we have all these kids that are consistently wearing these costumes and then eventually going out and attacking people to the point where we find out the one girl that saved that the main character guy. She ultimately gets completely stabbed within her own home, consistently, repetitiously stabbed. And then it ends up that they're like, oh, okay, well, like, clearly, like, we're going to go and try to solve that case. That's our next kind of, or we have to solve the case of these missing kids. It ends up that the main character's daughter just appears, like, basically, like, in his home. And then he is just kind of like, okay, how did you get here? There's no explanation for that. And eventually the main character calls his, I would assume, probably ex-wife, and mentioned that their daughter just appeared there, and so ultimately she has to go and go on a flight to ultimately like get her daughter back. So we end up to the aspect of, okay, now we have to, excuse me, we ultimately bizarrely have this daughter that isn't who she seems to be. She is under some other different personality, which was weird. Eventually, we find out that very much more and more that ultimately these kids are starting to kill people and go on rampages. And eventually it ends up to be where they end up killing a cop. We end up having this deputy go to this school to find these kids, and we ultimately end up finding some teacher. We find this teacher, and ultimately it's just kind of like supposedly she had ties with the kids previously of like especially the main character, like she was his teacher as well. Um, and funny enough, probably every single one of those people had seen Candle Cove that had been under this teacher, just like the younger kids had previously. So there seems to be a very much odd thing with this like old teacher, and it's kind of like, okay, what the f is going on? Like, so like ultimately, it seems like these characters or these younger kids or whatever are putting on this play of Candle Cove, and they're getting all this masks and makeup and stuff like that to do these Candle Cove performances. And it's just kind of getting to the point where it's just like, why is this teacher letting this all happen? It doesn't seem like a normal thing. To the point where they like the deputy tries to justify like why are you doing this performance of some Candle Cove that isn't really all that popular? You would think you do like Hamlet or Macbeth or something that people know, or that everybody's really much more familiar with. So we end up, if I haven't mentioned it already, the kids get together and kill one of the police officers. Because ultimately, like the police officer was trying to find the main character, and the main character like ultimately was going to like look around for something. This guy otherwise goes and decides to try to look for some noise that's going on, and he ultimately gets stabbed by all these kids. And then the main character guy goes out there to check on this guy, and then he ultimately gets uh like passed out. He ends up getting freaking like held on some bizarre strings at some point, and we eventually find out that there is a person behind this big creature esh like mask. She takes her mask off, and we find out that it's this teacher. And I'm like, oh yeah, like I was kind of assuming that it would probably be her because ultimately she had ties with both kids, both generation of kids, and ultimately what an easy way to just kind of master manipulate people by her just easily just being a teacher, and yeah, just being an easy way to eventually get these people to like manipulate them in the classroom if that's what you really got to do. But anyways, we find out that this teacher said that the whole entire idea was really the main character's brother. Like she just kind of like took this and kind of went a little bit further with it. Ultimately, kind of mentioning that she was gonna like make so many sacrifices and this and that. So eventually, of course, we get longer into this show, and there's a lot of just other kind of random-ish like things going on. Eventually, it gets down to the point to where eventually, kind of summing this up as quickly as possible, we get to the aspect of okay, like there is a time now where people start need to start dying at some point. We get to the aspect of like eventually it just gets down to the point to where the son and the mother are kind of eventually kind of going out. Eventually gets down to them having to kill this teacher, and like eventually it goes to the main character guy is having this like dream esh like sequence with his brother and quite possibly his daughter, and the brother is kind of breaking down all the stuff that he's going to do, what he's going to accomplish once he takes over his own brother. And all the while, eventually, the mother kills this teacher, and then eventually like, she ends up killing her own son while he's like laying down there, just like, meh. Because ultimately, when looking at it, like she needs to kill him because ultimately then there's no way for this to keep happening or for this brother to come back because he has nowhere to come back to. So yeah, a very ultimately like fairly odd show, a fairly weird and a bizarre thing, and I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that I probably skipped around or whatever. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of stuff that was kind of very slow. There was a lot of stuff that I probably like completely like skipped over for a reason. Just because there was a lot of times where I was like, man, this is really such a slow show that like at some points it kind of felt like just easy just have this show on as background noise at some point just because it was just kind of like I really need there to be something really important for me to spend my attention on. And yeah, so if anyways, yeah, there might have been something that I could have probably missed or some big story point whatever that I need to bring up here, but I don't know. I just like I feel like that's kind of like as quick as I can kind of get through this show. So that's how I felt about this show. I kind of felt severely 50-50 on this one. Because ultimately, I'm sure if I watched it again, I would probably feel differently. Or I would feel like, oh, this is what I didn't catch the first time around. So yeah, that's how I feel about Channel Zero. Ultimately, I don't really know if this show is going to be any popular or not, or whatever, or people like creepy pasta or not. So I don't know. Maybe I'm going into this and reviewing it, and ultimately no one cares. I don't know. But anyways, I'm going to get out of here so I can do other things for the day. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.